Hello everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak many years ago. And since then, I think I probably was at the V&A Museum of Childhood when we first met, and then I moved to Edinburgh Museum of Childhood, and now, as I said, I'm now a curator at Hilltop Beatrice Potter's House, but I'm not talking about Beatrice Potter today. I'm going to talk about some work that I did during my PhD, which I just finished last year. And also I need to give a content warning that my paper includes a racist term, which is one of the song titles that I'm going to talk about, and I'm still including it because it demonstrates the ideologies at work in juvenile performance. So I want to start by taking you back nearly a century, in fact 99 years, to the 10th of May 1923. It's 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening at Mile End Hospital and Institution in the East End of London. The dining hall of this Victorian workhouse has been turned into a makeshift theatre with rows of chairs and benches facing a stage at one end of the room. The front rows are taken by local worthies, the mayor and his wife, local councillors and ladies of the Jewish guilds, mixed with hospital management. Behind them, over 350 of the institution's so-called inmates, nurses and porters. The performers enter the stage, a procession of children, brightly dressed and smiling wide, and they start to introduce themselves as Madame Grace Behenna's Juvenile Jollities. A reviewer from the East London Observer was in the audience, and they reported, quote, "This talented band of children, ranging in age from 4 to 13 years, kept an enthusiastic audience perfectly interested and enthralled for 4 hours. The programme comprised songs, dances, floral ballet, tableau, recitations and dialogues. Several of the little artistes made a change of dress no less than 20 times. After the concert, the chair of the Board of Guardians addressed the crowd. The display, he said, had appeared to him to be like the Colosseum Leicester Square, and it was a great difficulty to realise the difference between the Colosseum and the institution dining hall that evening. The picture painted in the East London Observer contains everything that has fascinated me about this performing troupe. The contrasts of reality and fantasy, the workhouse and the Colosseum, the over-the-top excess of 20 costume changes, 4-hour performances, and all this magic conjured by children aged as young as 4. My bigger project on the Jollities reconstructs this whole world of children's performance after the First World War, tying in themes of fantasy, legislation, family and gender. But today I'm going to focus on a single artefact and how it gives a glimpse into the kaleidoscopic spectacle of the juvenile Jollities. So, who were the juvenile Jollities? I discovered them through a collection of costumes and programmes given to the V&A by Eileen Brock, who was born in 1915. Eileen, pictured here in costume. From 1925 to 26, when she was 10 or 11, Eileen was a member of Madame Behenna's Juvenile Jollities. The troupe was established in 1921 or thereabouts by Grace Behenna, who was a former draper's sweatshop worker turned talent manager. The troupe includes 20 to 30 children at any time, mostly girls based in Stoke Newington in North East London. About half the children came from Jewish families, and many had connections to the so-called rag trade. Parents were heavily involved in the troupe, as we would expect, from making costumes to paying compliments and booking venues, selling tickets, raising money. Grace Behenna ran this troupe for over 40 years. Hundreds of children would have taken part in that time, and thousands of people would have come to their concerts. Despite this, there are practically no first-person accounts from anyone involved in the Jollities. Even Eileen's memories were not recorded when she gave this donation to the museum in the 1980s. Slide, please. So the very few material traces that we have become much more eloquent. This is the crucial artefact that I'm going to use to frame my introduction to the Jollities today. This is Grace Behenna's instruction sheet for Eileen Brock's costumes from around October 1926. This morning, I can only briefly touch on the richness of this document and the history of the Jollities, but I'm going to go through a few of these costumes and songs, and each one is like a door into a whole world of research and context, but I'm going to just kind of dance my way through them. You can see on this list the titles of each piece that was performed and descriptions of the costumes that were worn, and some of them were to be made from scratch, so a swatch of the required fabric has been pinned to the piece of paper. Eileen's mother took this list to a specific shop in Dalston to buy the fabric and the patterns, which she then made up at home. So I'm going to dive in. The first costume on the list for the opening chorus says hero dress as before. So the hero costume was not made to Grace Behenna's specifications, but was actually retrieved from Eileen's mother, Amy's collection of old costumes. Amy had performed a bit in her youth and was a keen theatre-goer. When her husband Will was away in the army during war, they often wrote to each other. You don't get this in the Lake District. They often wrote to each other about pantomimes and musical and different shows that they'd seen. There is a photo from 1909, years before Eileen was born, of her older cousins dressed in a matching set of these costumes with Amy, Eileen's mother, in the middle. Not only did reusing this costume save Amy the expense and labour of making a new one, but it also materially brought Eileen into a family lineage of performers, which included her cousins and parents. And this is Eileen photographed in the costume, and this is the costume which brilliantly survives in the V&A. It looks like Eileen has even adopted the gestures and the physical embodiment of her older cousins here. In both photographs, the children have their fingers up in this strange gesture somewhere between shushing and admonishing. Did Amy direct Eileen to repeat that movement of the children 16 years before? This is a mysterious gesture that conjures the Pierrot's roots in Italian commedia dell'arte and mimed harlequinades of British pantomime. There is a description by Valerie Walkerdine talking about the ways that a desire to perform passes from mother to daughter. Rather than subsuming the daughter, she talks about how a mother's fantasies can open up a space for their child by providing an already existent dream for them to explore. It's certainly the case between Amy and Eileen that the Jollities troupe provided a space for both of them to be creative, to play significant roles, and to find a female-centred community. And the Pierrot costume also reminds us that public performances could have complex personal meanings. And next slide, please. So, the Juvenile Jollities belonged to the relatively new genre of revue, which combines songs, skits, recitations and dancing in topical satire and sentimentality. And partly because of this, revue as a genre has been described as endemically racist, and the Jollities were absolutely no exception. The children in the troupe repeated racist stereotypes and rehearsed dominant racist ideologies. The next song on the sheet is an example of this, Pickaninny Alley. The word pickaninny comes from American slang as a derogative term for a dark-skinned child. The lyrics of this song describe an American plantation scene of young black children who spend their days eating fruit and playing games in a blissful rural utopia complete with a rickety shack. And this was a widespread trope in 20th century American culture in advertising and entertainment. All kinds of stories and images of happy slaves were used to justify white supremacy. In Edwardian Britain, the Piccaninny character was used as a symbol of otherness and wildness and less than human. It turns up in Peter Pan as the name of Tiger Lily's tribe, and it was defined in another story as half human, half grotesque. It was a popular character in World War I charity books, for example. In the 1920s, when Eileen encountered it, this trope was enveloped by a so-called Dixie-philia, which is a trend for music and drama with plantation imagery and settings, which really took off in the 1920s and ignored the realities of slavery in favour of paternalistic fantasies that rewrote history. As you can imagine, there's a lot of context to this, but I want to focus on this costume that Eileen wore, which was incredibly bold, and we fortunately have a photograph as well of her wearing it. And this is a direct copy of the clothes worn by African American musicians of the southern states, usually men. These striped outfits were worn and often with a banjo, but it's playing the banjo, but it's been swapped for a ukulele when it's been kind of miniaturized for children to wear. And these striped outfits were in turn adopted by blackface performers and turned into parody. Blackface performances remained as popular as ever in London theatre in the 1920s, and it was those racist parodies that would have been most familiar to the Jollities audiences. In fact, the Jollities choreographer at this time, a woman called Madge Martin, was also the choreographer for the Metropolitan Police's blackface minstrel troupe. So there's a direct connection. However, there's no evidence that Eileen or the Jollities ever used blackface, but clearly the children on stage were channeling and repeating the same racist language and imagery. But whether Eileen had any idea that the origins of this costume or not, we don't know. Next slide, please. So the next costume on the list, I'm sorry for the sad photo of this lying down in the stores. The next costume on the list evoked nostalgic fantasies that were closer to home for the Jollities. Mother Kelly's Doorstep is now an East End standard, but for the Jollities it was a recent hit, having debuted in that year, 1925, in the pantomime Dick Whittington. The song describes how, as a child, the singer hung around the notorious slum Paradise Row in Bethnal Green. Spending days there, playing in the streets and sitting on the doorsteps, he fell in love with a girl called Nellie. The song's description of slum children on the streets evokes the street Arabs and urchins who populated London streets in the days before compulsory education, and in popular imagination had since transformed into a pitiful waif. Mother Kelly's Doorstep took the character of the slum child, who would have been familiar in reputation, if not reality, to the Jollities' parents and grandparents, and glossed it with a sheen of nostalgia for a lost past and a first love. In the hands of this children's troupe, memories of childhood poverty were transformed into the good old days. Eileen's costume was freshly made ragged, and it epitomised the sentimentalisation of East End history. Many of the Jollities' parents grew up exactly around Bethnal Green in those slums and had since moved out to the inner suburbs of Stoke Newington. So this was part of the mythology of that generation. And Behenna here has instructed the addition of patches on the dress and holes in the shoes. Next slide, please. The last costume that I'm going to talk about is the very sadly deteriorated bright red dress worn for the Bouquet ballet. This costume would have moved and felt completely different from the stiff brown dress worn for Mother Kelly's Doorstep. This bright scarlet carnation dress with layers of chiffon petals would have floated and fluttered upon Eileen's dancing body as she moved, giving her the opportunity for sensual enjoyment of colour and fabrics. It's hard to know how girls felt about these costumes.
as Kira mentioned, finding any insight into children's own experiences, the quest that we're all on. But a little insight comes from a near contemporary source. In 1929, Eve Macaulay, a psychology graduate of University College, conducted a survey about children's clothes. Macaulay asked girls aged 6 to 15 what did they like to wear, what did they dislike, and what would they wear to a party. Children, she concluded, favoured bright colours, and they had revealed a detailed knowledge of different types of fabric. The girls had shown a preference for apparently highly unsuitable garments. Girls had listed, and I quote from Macaulay, georgette, satin, velvet and silk as the material they would most like to wear, and some entered into elaborate descriptions of flounces and frills, low necks and short sleeves, and elaborate jewellery. What was it that Macaulay found so highly unsuitable in the girls' choices? Was it the fabrics themselves, or was it the transgressive enjoyment they seemed to get in their descriptions? Macaulay concluded, quote, that these children are living some kind of fantasy life and were evidently retarded. We might propose that the children in Macaulay's survey were in fact demonstrating their very thorough understanding of the transformative potential of clothing and the enjoyment and satisfaction that could be found from even imagining the feel of flounces and frills and their symbolic claims to maturity, wealth and opportunity. One girl mused that given the right clothes, I should be like a lady, which I long to be. There is such a close fit between the surveyed schoolgirls' fantasies and the reality of the costumes of the Jollities. Flounces, frills, low necks, short sleeves all feature in Behenna's costumes for her troupe. In the Jollities, girls wore chiffon, artificial silk, velveteen and sateen. The giveaway een could hardly have distracted from the children's enjoyment in wearing them. The Jollities' costumes gave spectacular enjoyment to their audiences and inspired glamorous fantasies while offering performers precisely the silky, luxurious feelings that materialised desire for the surveyed girls. The last thing that I want to get, the last point I want to make is about toe shoes, and the description of the bouquet costume ends with scarlet toe shoes. Above all others, this was the most contested item of costume for children in the mid-1920s. The ideological and institutional changes in ballet at this time are encapsulated in the renaming of toe dancing to point work. A little history about ballet. Until the First World War, ballet was mostly performed in music halls as part of variety shows and pantomimes. But in 1920, the Association of Teachers of Operatic Dancing of Great Britain, shortened to the AOD, formed and were determined to elevate the status of English ballet out of the halls and into opera houses. And children's dance education was central to this mission to redefine ballet and control the distribution of skills and gestures. Previously, teachers have been praised for their ability to turn 3-year-olds into toe dancers, but now any teacher who wanted to be registered with the AOD had to follow a system of closely moderated exams. Precocious or ambitious dancers who stepped outside their grade were punished with lost marks and potential failure. And any child who attempted, as Eileen did, this metonymic pose of the ballerina on point was liable to fail any exam that they attempted. It was reinforced in 1926 that there is no point work in any grade and children should wear unblocked shoes. Eileen found herself in the middle of this culture change. Aged 7, she started ballet lessons with a Miss Williams and discovered that she had a natural ability to dance on point. However, Miss Williams was a modern teacher, mindful of the new rules, and she would not permit Eileen to dance in this way. By accomplishing this move, Eileen had distinguished herself in the group as a dancer with real potential, and she was frustrated, no wonder, when her talents were thwarted. So before Eileen left Miss Williams' class, she appeared in the Four Seasons. You'll notice that she's not wearing the bouquet dress. This is from her performance in the Four Seasons for Miss Williams. And in this commemorative photograph, she stood defiantly on the tips of her toes. This suggests a rebellious determination to appear in the photographs as the ballet dancer that she wanted to be, even if in the real ballet, Miss Williams forbade her from dancing in that way. So Eileen joined the Jollities, where Grace Behenna had a much more Edwardian view of children's dance and allowed Eileen to toe dance in toe shoes just as she liked, making the most of her young performer's special talent. So to conclude, how did children experience performance in the Jollities? In her memoir, the dancer Margaret Morris describes her own feelings aged 12 when she became a professional performer. In the theatre, she said, I entered a world of fantasy that released me from a day-to-day existence. And despite the choreographed nature of their performances, the Jollities girls had freedoms not usually experienced by lower middle class girls off the stage. They had the freedom to move, to dance, and to develop strength in their bodies. As a member of the troupe, Eileen and the other Jollities expanded their experience of girlhood. In their concert, they flirted with frills and flounces and experimented with masquerades of age and gender. Grace Behenna's troupe gave the Jollities the space to dream and to dance on the very tips of their toes.